Alright, so in the last video we got our frame set up more or less. Time to get this engine and transmission mounted. Motor mounts are a funny thing because it can be a little bit intimidating, but honestly, they're pretty simple to make. It's very straightforward. If you can read a tape measure and you're a half decent welder, you can make motor mounts. Essentially all we need to do is hang the motor and transmission where we want them, and then measure to the frame and connect it. The only potential complication is we want some sort of bushing in between the engine and the frame. This helps isolate the engine a little bit, keep some of the vibration from making the ride horrible. In a street car, we're pretty much always going to want to try and keep that vibration in check, at least a little bit. Now, when you're playing Dr. Frankenstein and mashing parts together, you're going to run into a few issues no matter what. One of the things I knew was going to come up is that the Coyote motor is very wide and Model A frame rails are very narrow. As you can see right here, the oil filter in its stock location is not going to work. Lucky for me, a lot of people have done Coyote swaps at this point. A quick search on Google shows that a bunch of companies make oil filter relocation kits. So at some point I'll have to order one of those and get it mounted up. But for now, this thing can just come off. Also, it seems that while moving everything around, my super high performance rear springs fell out. I need to get those back in real quick. So I know I said making motor mounts is easy, and it is, but getting the engine exactly where you want it can be a little bit tricky. If you're doing a motor swap into a regular car, you kind of just put the engine where the engine's supposed to go. In a car like this, where everything's being built custom, there's no set exact spot where the engine's supposed to go. Now, from a performance standpoint, I'd like the engine as low as it could be and as far back as it could be. The engine is the single heaviest component of this car, so getting it as low as possible will help keep the center of gravity of the entire car down low, which should translate into a little bit better handling. Getting that weight towards the center of the car should also do the same. There are a couple things we have to consider though that are going to lead to compromises. One is I don't want the engine too low because I don't want the oil pan to be the lowest point of the car. That's just never a good idea. As far as moving the engine back, I do need some legroom, and the farther we push that engine back, the less legroom there is. Nobody likes driving with their knees in their chest all day. So with a little dancing around, I found a happy medium, something I could live with. Got everything positioned with my floor jack and engine hoist, some 2x4s. But also, just pro tip, keep some 2x4s around. They're always handy. It's worth pointing out, it can be pretty annoying to stop and go back and forth, but it's absolutely worth the time to take a minute, mock things up, double check your clearances, make sure everything's where you want it, and do all that before you start welding anything. With everything where I wanted it, I pulled off the stock cast aluminum motor mounts, did some measuring, grabbed some good old cereal box template making material, and got to work. To start with, I cut out some 1/4-inch steel big enough to cover all the mounting holes on the block. Then over to the belt grinder for a little bit of cleanup. After that, I hopped on the drill press, drilled the holes to match my pattern so I could bolt this plate to the side of the engine. And just a friendly reminder, when you're using a drill press, clamp your piece. For the love of John Moses Browning, trust me. I see people doing this all the time where they hold a piece and just use the drill press. As someone who's done that and had a piece bind up and spin around and almost break my hand, take my word for it. Use a clamp or a vise or whatever. With the plate cut out, I could bolt it up to the side of the engine. Now the stock bolts had to go through that thick cast aluminum motor mount, so they had to be a lot longer than what I'll need. Unfortunately, I didn't have the right size bolts laying around, so I grabbed some sockets as spacers, and they'll hold until I can get to the hardware store. With the plate bolted up, I took some measurements so I could be sure of how long or tall this motor mount needed to be. I wanted the tabs on the frame side to be as small as possible, wanted to keep everything compact and nice looking, but I did need to make sure I had enough clearance for the bushing. With all that sorted, I took all the pieces over to my fixture table. I grabbed some scrap, welded it together, and drilled a couple holes so I could mount the bushing at the exact height I wanted for the length of the motor mounts. Plus a 1/4 inch, the thickness of the plate that will be mounted to the engine. I wasn't super worried about the positioning on this. I just wanted to make sure that the height was right and that the tabs on the frame would be even with each other. Other than that, these motor mounts are not going to be symmetrical, so this super simple jig will do the job, no sweat. If I needed the mounts to be exactly symmetrical, I would have set up a little bit different deal with the jig so that the engine plate would be in the exact same spot relative to the bushing when I was welding. I then used the other bushing to start making templates for the plate that would become the connector pieces between the bushing and the engine side plate. Nothing too fancy here, just some trial and error. Kept going till it fit. After doing the other sides, it was just a matter of transferring the templates to metal, welding them in. Now, tubing would have worked here instead of going with plate, and it arguably may have been a better choice because it probably would have been lighter. Spoiler alert, these turned out pretty heavy. I went with plate for 2 reasons, and neither of them are very important. One is I just like the look of it. I just think it looks cool. The other is that I'm still relatively new to TIG welding, and the only way to get good at TIG welding is a lot of hours of TIG welding. When you build things out of plate, you end up doing a lot of welding. Since this is a nice small part, fits on the bench, figured it'd be a good thing to practice on. So to start with, I just got everything tacked in place. I need to be very careful about my heat because that bushing in there has a melting point way lower than the steel. Now, there is an ideal way to do this. You make an aluminum slug that's the same size as the bushing and use that while you're mocking everything up and welding everything together. Unfortunately, I do not have a lathe to make myself a nice custom aluminum slug. So I'm going to do a really small tack and try not to burn up the bushing. If you're careful, you can get away with this. If you sit with the heat too long, it won't go well for you. You will melt that bushing and it will smell bad. It's probably not good for you, and you have to buy a new bushing. So just remember, when skating on thin ice, our safety is in our speed. With everything tacked up, it's kind of starting to look like a motor mount. Wait and put it back on the engine just to double check before everything's welded up solid. Then pull the bushings out. Here you can see where I got a little too hot on one of the tacks, but overall, we're okay. Then comes the fun part, welding everything together. Now our motor mounts are basically done, or at least the motor mount itself is done. Welding came out pretty good. Could have been better where the pieces meet up, kind of the wraparound part. But better today than I was yesterday, so I'm happy. I put the bushings back in and bolted the motor mounts to the motor. And somewhere in between all that, I snuck off to the store and picked up some bolts that actually fit. Now we're almost there. A couple frame tabs and we'll be good to go. Since the bushing's in place and I don't want to burn it, same as when I was on the bench. Quick tacks, take the bushing out, go back, weld it up all solid. There's one little thing here I want to point out. Welding these tabs up without the motor mount in place, it's pretty much guaranteed that they're going to warp a little bit. One way to make sure they stay where I want them is to pull that steel sleeve out of the center of the bushing. Because it's steel, the heat won't really hurt it. One other little trick I've learned over the years, that bushing sleeve is the exact width I need. If I weld the tabs up with that sleeve tightened down, that gap between the tabs is going to be the exact width of the sleeve and the bushing. That's going to make it kind of a pain to get the bushing in and out. So what I'm doing is I add a couple washers to one side of the sleeve. That'll make my tabs actually about 1/8 of an inch wider than they need to be. When I put the motor mount in for final assembly, crank everything down, there's enough flex in the tabs to close that gap. So that just makes life a little easier while fitting things, mocking things up, taking things in and out. And there's less risk of chewing up the bushing as it rubs against the tabs. And there we have it. Motor mounts are done. Engine's mounted. I had to pull the engine transmission back out to be able to weld the sides of the tabs. And while I was at it, I added a plate across the top to make everything look a little more finished. Unfortunately, I forgot to film all that. So take my word for it. In the next vid, we'll work on getting this transmission mounted. There are a few things I might do different next time. That's the nature of the beast, always learning. Overall, I'm really happy with how these things came out.